The November rain drummed against the windows of the Victorian house on Maple Street, each droplet a reminder of the countless storms Margaret Henderson had weathered within these walls. At 72, she moved through the familiar rooms with a deliberate slowness that had nothing to do with her age and everything to do with the weight of the decision she'd made. The mahogany floorboards, installed by her late husband Robert 40 years ago, creaked beneath her feet as she made her way to the kitchen. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, a small comfort on this gray Seattle morning. Margaret poured herself a cup, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Through the kitchen window, she could see the garden she'd tended for decades, now overgrown and neglected, much like the relationships in her life. "Mom?" The voice startled her, though she'd been expecting him. David stood in the doorway, his expensive suit impeccable as always, his smile too bright for such a dreary day. At 45, her only son had achieved everything society deemed successful: a partnership at a prestigious law firm, a mansion in Bellevue, and a wife who graced the society pages. Yet Margaret saw past the veneer to the impatient glint in his eyes, the way he checked his phone even as he greeted her. "David," she said, setting down her cup, "you're early." "Well, I figured we should get this done before my meeting at noon." He moved into the kitchen with the confidence of someone who'd already mentally redecorated the space. "Where's the paperwork?" Margaret gestured to the dining room, where she'd laid out the documents on the table her grandmother had brought from Ireland. David's eyes lit up as he saw the stack of papers, and Margaret's heart constricted. When had her boy become this stranger who saw their family home as nothing more than a real estate opportunity? "This is great, Mom. Really great." David was already flipping through the pages, his practiced eye scanning the legal language. "The market's hot right now. This place could easily go for $2 million, maybe more with some updates." "Updates?" Margaret's voice was soft. "Oh, gut the kitchen, knock out some walls, maybe add a second story. Buyers want open concept these days." He didn't look up from the papers, didn't see the way his mother's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. Margaret watched him, remembering the little boy who used to help her bake cookies in this very kitchen, flour dusting his chubby cheeks. She thought of the crayon marks still hidden behind the refrigerator, the growth chart penciled on the doorframe that he'd already mentioned painting over. Each memory was a ghost that David seemed eager to exorcise. "Your father built this kitchen," she said quietly. David's laugh was short, dismissive. "Dad was many things, but he wasn't a contractor. I've already talked to some developers who specialize in flipping these old Victorians. They can work miracles." The rain intensified, casting shifting shadows across the room. Margaret had lived in this house for 43 years, had raised her son here, had nursed Robert through his final illness in the upstairs bedroom. Every corner held a story, every imperfection a memory, and David wanted to gut it all. "Have you talked to Jennifer about this?" Margaret asked, referring to David's wife. "She's thrilled. She's already looking at furniture for our place. We're thinking of adding a wine cellar with the profit." He finally looked up, misreading his mother's expression. "Don't worry, Mom. Your room at Sunset Gardens is all set. They have great facilities, daily activities, medical staff on site. You'll love it." Sunset Gardens. The name itself felt like a euphemism, a pretty label slapped on the reality of her impending irrelevance. Margaret had visited the facility once, had seen the beige walls and artificial cheerfulness. The residents shuffled from meal to activity like children at a daycare. It was clean, safe, and utterly devoid of soul. "I need you to read the entire document," Margaret said, her voice stronger now. "Mom, I'm a lawyer. I know how to read a contract." But something in her tone made him pause. "Is there a problem?" "No problem. Just read it all, especially the last page." David sighed, the sound of a busy man indulging an elderly parent. He flipped to the final page, his eyes moving quickly over the text. Margaret watched his face, saw the moment his expression changed, the smile faltering as he reached the last clause. "What is this?" His voice had lost its casual confidence. "Exactly what it says," Margaret replied, taking a sip of her coffee. David read aloud, his tone incredulous. "The transfer of property is contingent upon the following conditions. The recipient must maintain primary residence in the property for a minimum of 5 years. The property may not be sold, rented, or substantially renovated during this period. The recipient must host family gatherings for all major holidays. The garden must be maintained according to the included specifications. Failure to meet these conditions will result in the property reverting to the Margaret Henderson Trust, to be distributed to designated charities." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain against the windows. David's face had gone from confused to angry, the color rising in his cheeks. "This is ridiculous," he said finally. "You can't be serious." I'm quite serious. Mom, I have a life. I have a career. I can't just abandon everything to play house in this museum. Margaret set down her cup carefully. Then don't sign. And what? Let you stay here alone? You fell last month? You forget things? You need care. I had a dizzy spell. And everyone forgets things occasionally. David's laugh was harsh now, nothing like the joyful sound she remembered from his childhood. This is exactly why you need to be in a facility. This clause, it's not even legally enforceable. No judge would uphold this. Perhaps not, Margaret agreed. But then you'd have to take your mother to court, wouldn't you? Imagine how that would look. Successful lawyer sues elderly mother over family home. I'm sure your partners would find that fascinating. She watched the calculations flickering behind his eyes, could see him weighing options, looking for loopholes. It was what he did best, after all. Find the angle, maximize the profit, minimize the complications. But this time, Margaret had been careful. She'd consulted her own lawyer, Robert's old friend Samuel, who'd helped her craft something ironclad. Why? David asked finally, and for a moment, she heard a trace of the boy he'd been. Why would you do this? Margaret stood, moving to the window. The garden was visible despite the rain, the old oak tree standing sentinel as it had for a century. Do you remember the treehouse your father built for you? Mom, you spent entire summers up there. You said you'd live in this house forever, that you'd raise your own children here. I was 8 years old. Yes, she said softly. You were. David was pacing now, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the floor. This is emotional blackmail. You're trying to manipulate me into, what? Abandoning my life? Jennifer will never agree to this. Then I suppose you have a decision to make. This is insane. You're not thinking clearly. Maybe we should have you evaluated. David, her voice cut through his tirade. I've never been more clear-headed in my life. This house isn't just property. It's our history, our family's story. And if you can't see that, if all you see is dollar signs and square footage, then you're not ready to inherit it. He stared at her, and she saw the moment he realized she was serious. Truly serious. The anger faded, replaced by something more complex. Frustration, certainly, but also a flicker of uncertainty. I need to think about this, he said finally. Of course. Take all the time you need. David gathered the papers, his movements sharp with suppressed emotion. I'll have my attorney review these. I expected you would. At the door, he paused. You know I'm trying to do what's best for you. Margaret nodded. I know you believe that. After he left, she stood in the quiet house, listening to the rain and the settling of old bones, both hers and the building's. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching familiar surfaces, remembering. In the living room, she paused before the family photos arranged on the mantel. David at 5, grinning with a gap-toothed smile, his high school graduation, Robert's proud hand on his shoulder, their last family Christmas, before everything changed. The phone rang, startling her from her reverie. She knew it would be David, probably calling from his car, ready to negotiate, but she let it ring. Some conversations needed time to marinate, like the stews she used to make that David claimed to hate but always asked for seconds. She climbed the stairs to the attic, each step a small victory against the arthritis in her knees. The space was dusty, filled with boxes and memories. She found what she was looking for in a corner, a wooden chest that had belonged to Robert's mother. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, were the things she'd saved. David's first shoes, his report cards, all A's. The Father's Day card he'd made at age 6, declaring Robert the best dad in the whole universe, in crooked crayon letters. At the bottom of the chest was a manila envelope, sealed and labeled in Robert's careful handwriting, for David, when the time is right. Margaret had never opened it, had honored her husband's wishes even after his death, but she'd wondered, especially in recent years, what message Robert had left for their son. She held the envelope up to the light, tempted as always to peek inside. But no, if David agreed to the conditions, if he came back to live in this house, then maybe he'd be ready to hear whatever his father had wanted to say. And if not, well, some messages were meant to remain undelivered. The rain was letting up, weak sunlight filtering through the clouds. Margaret made her way back downstairs, her joints protesting. In the kitchen, she washed her coffee cup, a simple task that grounded her. Through the window, she could see a neighbor walking their dog, life continuing its ordinary rhythm despite the small drama playing out in her home. The house felt different now, charged with possibility and conflict. Would David accept the terms? Would he rage against them, try to find legal ways around them? Or would he simply walk away, leave her to live out her remaining years here alone before the house went to charity? Margaret didn't know, and But she'd played her hand, had set in motion something that would either heal their fractured relationship or break it entirely. The last clause, the one David had read with such incredulity, wasn't about control or manipulation. It was about remembering what mattered, about forcing her successful, driven son to slow down long enough to rediscover the boy who'd once promised to live here forever. She moved to the living room, settling into Robert's old recliner. The leather had molded to his shape over the years, and sometimes she imagined she could still smell his cologne, feel his presence. What would he think of what she'd done? Would he approve of her gambit, or would he tell her to let the boy make his own choices? He needs to remember, she said aloud to the empty room. He needs to understand what he's so eager to throw away. The afternoon stretched before her, quiet and uncertain. Somewhere across the city, David was probably pacing his corner office, making phone calls, looking for angles. Jennifer was likely being consulted, her reaction predictable. Horror at the thought of leaving their Bellevue mansion for this old Victorian, at having to host family gatherings, tend a garden, live a life bounded by someone else's conditions. But Margaret remembered other things too. She remembered David bringing Jennifer here for the first time, how the younger woman's eyes had widened at the crown molding, the built-in bookshelves, the character that no modern construction could replicate. She remembered Jennifer in the garden, delighted by the heirloom roses, asking about their history. There had been a time when both of them had seen the magic of this place. The question was whether they could see it again, or whether the years of climbing ladders and chasing success had blinded them permanently to simpler values. A key turned in the lock. David still had his copy, of course. Margaret didn't move from the recliner, waiting to see which version of her son would walk through the door. The angry lawyer, ready to argue? The concerned son, worried about her mental state? Or maybe, just maybe, the boy who'd once loved this house as much as she did? Footsteps in the hallway, hesitant now, lacking the earlier confidence. David appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, his perfect hair slightly mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. "I canceled my meeting," he said. Margaret nodded, saying nothing. "Jennifer thinks I should have you declared incompetent. And what do you think?" He moved into the room, his eyes traveling over the familiar space as if seeing it for the first time in years. I think I haven't been paying attention." It wasn't an acceptance of her terms. Not yet. But it was a beginning. A crack in the armor he'd built around himself. Margaret felt something ease in her chest. A knot she hadn't realized was there. "There's coffee in the kitchen," she said. "Why don't you pour yourself a cup and we can talk?" David nodded, and as he turned toward the kitchen, Margaret thought she saw a ghost of the boy he'd been in the slope of his shoulders, the way he automatically avoided the creaky board by the doorway. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds completely, casting long shadows across the garden. The old house settled around them, patient as always, waiting to see what story would unfold within its walls. Margaret closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of hope. Perhaps the last clause would do what she'd intended, not trap her son, but free him. Free him from the relentless drive that had consumed his life, from the belief that value could only be measured in dollars and square feet. Free him to remember what it meant to be home, the sound of cups clinking in the kitchen, of water running, of ordinary life continuing. Margaret smiled, thinking of Robert, of all the conversations they'd had about their son's future. They'd wanted success for him, yes, but not at the cost of his soul. "Mom?" David called from the kitchen. "Where do you keep the sugar now?" "Same place as always," she called back. "Third cabinet, second shelf." Some things, she thought, should never change. And perhaps with patience and the right conditions, her son might remember why. Chapter 1 ends here. The story has established the central conflict, the main characters, and the emotional stakes. Margaret's clever use of the last clause has created a situation that will force David to confront his values and potentially rediscover his connection to his family home and heritage. Please type OK when you're ready for Chapter 2. Tentar novamente, Gok editar, Chapter 2, The Unraveling. The conference room at Brennan Klein and Associates commanded a view of downtown Seattle that usually made David feel invincible. Today, the city spread below him like a judgment, each building a reminder of deals made, properties flipped, lives reduced to profit margins. He'd been staring at his mother's contract for 3 hours, his partnership meeting forgotten, his phone buzzing with ignored messages. "This is sophisticated work," said Martin Chen, the firm's senior real estate attorney, setting down the document. "Whoever drafted this knew exactly what they were doing. The conditions are specific, measurable, and the reversion clause, it's airtight." David rubbed his temples. "There has to be a way around it." "Sure, don't sign it." Martin leaned back in his leather chair. Look, David, I've known you for 15 years. You're trying to solve this like a legal problem, but maybe it's not one. What else would it be? Martin shrugged. A mother trying to keep her son close? Just a thought. After Martin left, David remained in the empty conference room. Through the glass walls, he could see his colleagues going about their day, billing hours, making deals, climbing the ladder he'd spent 2 decades scaling. His corner office was visible from here, the symbol of everything he'd achieved. His phone rang. Jennifer. Tell me you found a loophole, she said without preamble. It's complicated. No, David, it's not. It's insane. Your mother has lost her mind. And we need to take action. I've already called Dr. Morrison about getting a psychological evaluation. Jennifer, 5 years? In that old house? Do you know what that means? Private school for Madison would be impossible from there. The commute alone would kill your billable hours. And the entertaining we'd have to do? She paused. We'd be the laughingstock of the club. David closed his eyes. The club, their social circle, where success was measured in square footage and stock portfolios, where Jennifer thrived, organizing charity galas that raised money for causes she couldn't quite articulate, where their daughter Madison, now 13, was learning that worth was determined by brand names and zip codes. Maybe that wouldn't be the worst thing, he said quietly. The silence on the other end was deafening. I'm sorry. What? Jennifer's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. Nothing. I'll figure it out. You'd better. Because I didn't marry you to end up in some drafty Victorian playing happy family with your mother. Fix this, David. Use whatever means necessary. The line went dead. David set down his phone, Jennifer's words echoing in the sterile conference room. Whatever means necessary. Is that what his life had become? A series of transactions where even family relationships were subject to cost-benefit analysis? He left the office early, something he never did, and instead of heading home to Bellevue, found himself driving through the old neighborhood. The streets were narrower here, lined with trees that had been saplings when he was a boy. He passed the park where his father had taught him to ride a bike, the corner store where he'd bought candy with allowance money, the school where he'd first learned to value achievement above all else. The Victorian came into view, its purple and gold paint faded but still distinctive. His mother had fought the Historical Society to keep those colors, had insisted on authenticity over the neutral tones they'd recommended. As a teenager, he'd been embarrassed by the house's flamboyance. Now, surrounded by identical McMansions in his Bellevue neighborhood, he found himself appreciating its stubborn individuality. He parked but didn't get out immediately. A memory surfaced. Age 10, coming home from school to find his father on a ladder, painting the intricate gingerbread trim. Want to help? Robert had asked, and David had spent the afternoon learning to steady his hand, to see the beauty in detail work. They'd talked about everything and nothing. Baseball, school, the importance of taking care of what you love. When had he stopped taking care of what he loved? The front door opened, and his mother appeared on the porch. She didn't wave or call out, just stood there, waiting. David grabbed the contract from his briefcase and walked up the familiar path, noting the loose brick on the third step that had been loose for 20 years. I thought you might come back today, Margaret said, stepping aside to let him in. We need to discuss this rationally. All right. Would you like some tea? He followed her to the kitchen, where she put the kettle on. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes and memories. Everything was exactly as it had been that morning, yet somehow different, charged with the weight of decision. Do you remember, Margaret said, measuring tea leaves, when you were 14 and announced you were going to be a lawyer? Of course. He'd been so certain, so driven even then. Your father was worried. He said ambition without anchor was dangerous. She poured hot water over the leaves. I told him you'd find your anchor eventually. Mom, but you never did you? You found Jennifer, but she's not an anchor. She's another sail, pushing you further from shore. David bristled. Don't blame Jennifer for my success. Success. Margaret set a cup before him. Such an interesting word. Your father's definition was different from yours. Dad was a high school history teacher who never made more than $50,000 a year, and yet he was the richest man I knew. She sat across from him. He had time to build tree houses, to help with homework, to sit on this very porch and watch sunsets. Can you remember the last sunset you watched, David? He couldn't. His days ended in office fluorescence, his evenings in the blue glow of laptop screens. Sunsets were lost time, unbillable hours. The world has changed, he said. You can't just opt out anymore. There are responsibilities, obligations. To whom? To my family. Madison's education alone. Madison. Margaret's face softened. When did she last visit? David shifted uncomfortably. She's busy. School, activities. She used to love the attic here. Remember? She'd spend hours going through the old trunks, making up stories. Margaret sipped her tea. But that was before Jennifer decided it was too dusty for her allergies. She does have allergies. To dust? Or to anything that doesn't fit her image? The words hung between them, sharp with truth. David thought of his daughter, increasingly distant, speaking in Instagram captions and brand names. When had he last had a real conversation with her? When had she stopped being his little girl and become Jennifer's project? This isn't about Madison, he said. Isn't it? Margaret pulled out a photo album he hadn't seen in years. Look at these. Despite himself, David looked. There he was at Madison's age, grinning in the backyard, covered in mud from helping his father plant the vegetable garden. Another photo, the three of them at Christmas, the tree imperfect but loved, his mother's homemade cookies cooling on the counter. And another, his high school graduation, his parents' pride evident even in the faded photograph. This is emotional manipulation, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. This is remembering, Margaret corrected. Something you've gotten very good at avoiding. David's phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer. Where are you? The Hendersons are coming for dinner. The Hendersons. More lawyers, more networking, more careful conversation designed to advance careers and social standing. He thought of his mother's condition. Family gatherings for all major holidays. When had holidays become networking opportunities instead of celebrations? I should go, he said, standing. Before you do, there's something else. Margaret left the room, returning with a manila envelope. Your father left this for you. I was supposed to give it to you when the time was right. David stared at the envelope, his father's handwriting visible on the front. Why now? Because now you're at a crossroads. The same one your father faced once. Dad never faced anything like this? Margaret smiled sadly. Oh, David, you really don't know, do you? Know what? Sit. This is a story you need to hear. Against his better judgment, David sat. The Hendersons could wait. Jennifer could wait. Something in his mother's voice demanded attention. When you were 2, Margaret began, your father was offered a position at the University of Washington. Double the salary, prestige, research opportunities, everything he'd worked for. This was new. He never mentioned it. The position required extensive travel, publishing pressure, 60-hour weeks minimum. He'd have become the scholar he'd always dreamed of being. Margaret refilled their cups. He agonized for weeks. I told him to take it. We were young, struggling, living in a tiny apartment. But he didn't. No. He chose the high school position instead. Chose this house, this life, this chance to be present for you. She met his eyes. He never regretted it, but he always wondered if you understood the choice he made. David held the envelope, suddenly afraid to open it. His father had been his hero once, before David had learned to equate success with salary, before he'd started seeing Robert's contentment as complacency. He was proud of you, Margaret continued, but also worried. He saw you choosing a different path, saw Jennifer encouraging that choice, and he wondered if he'd failed to teach you the most important lesson, which was that some things can't be measured in billable hours. David's phone rang. Jennifer again. He let it go to voicemail. If I did this, he said slowly, if I agreed to your terms, Jennifer might leave me. Margaret's expression was carefully neutral. Yes, Madison would have to change schools. There are excellent schools here. My career would suffer, perhaps. Or perhaps it would change. David turned the envelope over in his hands. Why didn't you just sell to me normally? Why the conditions? Because you wouldn't have heard me. You'd have flipped this house without a second thought, scattered our history to the winds, and considered it good business. Margaret leaned forward. This way, you have to choose. Really choose. Not between house and career, but between the life you've built and the life you could have. That's not fair. No, she agreed. It's not. They sat in silence as shadows lengthened across the kitchen. David thought of the meeting he'd missed, the dinner he was missing now, the careful architecture of his life beginning to show cracks. He thought of Madison, of the girl she'd been before private school, and country clubs had polished away her enthusiasm. He thought of Jennifer, beautiful and cold as the marble countertops she loved. And he thought of this house, repository of memories and possibilities. I need more time, he said finally. Take what you need, but David? Margaret touched his hand. Don't take too long. I'm not getting younger, and neither are you. He left with the envelope unopened, the contract unsigned, his life suspended between what was and what could be. The drive to Bellevue had never seemed longer, each mile stretching like a year, taking him further from something he couldn't quite name. At home, the Hendersons' cars were in the driveway. Through the windows, he could see Jennifer holding court, her laugh bright and artificial as chandelier light. Madison was nowhere to be seen, probably in her room, excluded from adult conversation, learning that children were accessories to be displayed only when convenient. David sat in his car, engine off, holding his father's letter. Inside his house, his showpiece house with its professional staging and empty soul, his life waited. The life he'd built so carefully, climbing toward a summit that kept receding. Or he could open the letter, face whatever message his father had left, make a choice that would ripple through everything he'd built, everything he'd become. A text from Jennifer. "Where are you?" A text from his assistant. "Tomorrow's calendar is full. First meeting at 7 a.m. A text from his mother. None. She'd said what she needed to say. David looked at the Victorian key on his keychain, the one he'd never removed despite Jennifer's suggestions. Such a small thing, tarnished with age, worn smooth by generations of hands. His grandfather's, his father's, his own as a child racing home from school. Inside the Bellevue house, someone turned on music, something classical and expensive sounding that no one really listened to. It drifted across the manicured lawn, as substantial as smoke. David opened his father's letter. "Dear son," it began in Robert's careful teacher's handwriting. "If you're reading this, then you're facing the choice I always knew would come." The words blurred as David read, his father's voice somehow audible in the silence of the car. By the time he finished, the dinner party had moved to dessert. Jennifer's laugh had grown sharper with wine and irritation, and David understood that his mother's conditions weren't a trap. They were a lifeline. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in his chest pocket, and finally went inside to face the life he'd built, and the decision that would define whether he kept it or chose something else entirely. The Victorian key pressed against his leg as he walked, a small weight carrying the gravity of generations. Asking a simple question,